Hi everybody, Granddad here again. And what am I up to today? Well, today I'm going to show you another one of my little models. Now, as you know, I like ships and I've made a lot of model ships, but this one isn't a ship and it isn't very big. In fact, I've got it right here on the desk in front of me and I'll lift it up so you can see it. And what it is, it's a tiny little plane. It's a single propeller on the front there. If I turn it round, got some very flimsy little wheels there, and it's got 3 wings. So this is known as a triplane. And it's got a cockpit. You can see in the back there, and in front of that cockpit there's 2 machine guns. Now this plane is a Fokker DR-1, and it was flown by a very famous pilot. His name was Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, and he was one of the most celebrated pilots of World War I on the German side. Now, this little video that I'm doing today is about this little plane that I made. As you can see, it's quite tiny, and I've got a little picture here which came with it, the instructions. Oh, well, you can see that, but you'll notice there's some German crosses on it. Now, I haven't included, I've got the crosses in this little packet here, but they're very difficult to put on. You have to use water. They're not sticky transfers like you get these days. You have to do them with water. You have to wet them and slide them off and put them on. So I never actually got round to putting the because I made this little biplane about I don't know, 15-20 years ago. It was another one of my projects that I made while I was ill. But it's a nice little model. I'm not all that keen on airplanes, but this one really interested me. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pilot, von Richthofen, and he was known as the Red Baron. And he was born. He was a Prussian. He came from Prussia. He wasn't actually lived in Germany. He actually lived in Prussia. And he was born on May the 2nd, 1892. And unfortunately, in his career of being a fighter pilot, he shot down a great many men. As I said, he was the most decorated pilot of World War I. He made over 80 kills during his career, and he was actually shot down not by another airplane, but by ground fire from the ground. There's still a lot of controversy about how he actually died. There's a lot of people say he was shot down by a famous fighter ace from on the British side, but I don't think that was true. I've seen evidence to prove that he was shot out on that day by several people, 2 of which were on the ground. One was and the last one to shoot him down, or shoot at him, was an Australian. I think his name was Pitkin or something like that, and he shot at him from the ground. He was the last person to shoot at him, and although the Red Baron was fatally wounded, he managed to somehow get his plane down without smashing it to pieces completely, and he actually died on the ground. And they maintain that the last person that shot at him was probably the one that killed him, because he wouldn't have lasted more than a few minutes after he was shot, because the bullet entered on his right side, lower down on his back, and it entered through his chest on the other side, and the bullet was actually found in his flying jacket. So it was what was quite a long shot, because the bullet hadn't got a lot of power, and they actually found the bullet in his flying jacket, but it had ripped through his body and fatally injured him. And Apparently he was still alive when he landed, and when they got to him and pulled him out of the aircraft, he was still alive, and he managed to say something in German. And that was one report. They don't know quite what he said, but he said something in German. But another report said that when he actually, what he actually said, it wasn't German, may not be in German, or it may have been in German, but what it meant was kaputt. And I'm afraid that was his kaputt. And he was only, I think he was 25 years old. He was killed on April 21st, 1918. That's towards the end of the First World War. And he was flying over enemy territory, which was unusual. He was being a bit reckless in following an aeroplane into enemy territory, and he flew over to chase an airplane. I don't know whether he actually shot that plane down, but he made a mistake that day. He shouldn't have flown so low and over enemy territory for so long, and gave opportunity for people to shoot him down. He had actually been shot through the head on a previous mission, and he had served an head injury, but he managed to land the plane all right, and he survived that one. But that may have marred his judgment a little bit. I don't know. He may have got a bit foolhardy and taking chances that he shouldn't have done maybe in his younger days, or he wouldn't have took the chances, but he took the chance on that day, and it was unlucky for him that he got shot down. Now, his life story is quite interesting. I mean, I recommend anybody that's interested in this story to look up Manfred von Richthofen, because he had a very interesting life. He was a young boy. When he was a young boy with his brother, he actually was born into a very well-to-do family, and although they nicknamed him the Bloody Red Baron, he was actually a baron. He was quite you know, he was quite entitled to call himself the Red Baron, or the Baron, because he was from a very wealthy Prussian family. And in his younger days, he used to go out with his brother, his younger brother, hunting in the woods with a rifle when he was quite young. And he would get up to all sorts of hunting expeditions, and he liked nothing better than hunting and fishing and shooting. And he was a very careful huntsman. He would stalk his target and shoot it down very accurately and take a trophy. Unlike his brother, which would just fire anywhere he could and hope to hit something, von Richthofen was very calculated and a very skillful hunter for animals, and he liked doing that. And I think that maybe was part of his character. He was somebody that liked hunting. He liked the idea of the chase and the hunt, and he certainly showed that in his aircraft days. But he didn't start by going into the Air Force or the German Air Force. He actually was a soldier. When he was younger, he always wanted to go into the armed forces, and he wanted to be a soldier, and he joined a regiment of horse artillery, horse soldiers. I don't know quite what they call them in Germany, but so and he did that for a while because planes weren't really considered to be of much use in warfare or flying, because as you can see by this little model, they're very flimsy. I mean, they were made of wood and canvas, and virtually they were just like a flying kite. And the earlier ones, they had two compartments in, because you'd have somebody sitting in the front flying the plane and someone sitting behind, and they were used for reconnaissance. They'd fly over enemy territory and look out for troops on the ground, and then go back and report back where they'd seen troops and fortifications were being made and things like that. So they were used as a reconnaissance things. They weren't even thought of as a fighting force, because they actually tried putting machine guns onto planes, and they were so heavy that they actually crashed, and they were just not capable of carrying weapons. But later on in the war, they managed to find out that there was a way of to lighten the load on these planes by only having one pilot. As you see, there's only one cockpit on here for one pilot, and as you see, the machine guns are mounted, because in the old days the machine gun, they had to shoot out of the side. The observer or the second pilot would be able to shoot out of the side. He couldn't shoot backwards because he could shoot his tail off, and he certainly couldn't shoot forwards because the propeller would get shot off. and it made it very difficult for these things to be used in any sort of warfare or combat. But they developed them slowly during the war, and they invented a very special gearing arrangement so that they could have these guns. And you see there's two machine guns mounted on the front of this little model. They managed to make it so that the machine guns were geared and synchronized with the propeller, so it only fired when the propeller was in this position, sort of crossways. If the propeller was up here, the guns wouldn't fire until they got down there again, and the guns would fire, and then they'd stop, and then they'd fire again. So they wouldn't shoot their own propeller off, and that meant they only needed one man in there, and he could operate two machine guns. And they were a bit precarious. They didn't always work properly. They jammed quite easily, as you can imagine, being geared to the propeller. So they went wrong quite often. But towards the end, they discovered that these planes really were useful, and they had whole squadrons put together so that they could fly up and protect the observers that were looking for troops and things, and they would have fighting force. And Baron von Richthofen had his own flying corps when he got to be a pilot. But he, as I say, he didn't start off as a pilot. He went into the army as a horse soldier, but he got sort of bored with that because there was not much action, and so he met several people that sort of encouraged him to think about some other path. And as the war was commencing, he thought the best action, the best way of serving his country, because he's very patriotic. I think he really, believed in the cause, and like any soldier in any country would fight for his country. He was very proud to go flying aircraft. Now he started off as a second pilot in the compartment there, but he soon found that he wanted to actually do the flying. And when they invented these new planes where they could have just one pilot and fly the plane, and he could do it himself, he soon got involved with that. And partly his skill as a marksman and someone who stalked his prey, he became really good at it. Now, one of the strange things that von Richthofen did, when he made his first kill with his plane early on, I think he made his first kill as a co-pilot, not actually a pilot, presumably shooting through the side of the airplane. He brought a plane down, and he went to a jeweler somewhere in one of the towns, and he got them to make a silver cup, and he had printed on that cup the actual kill and the airplane he shot down. So it was like a little trophy, and this is his mindset from a young boy. He liked to take trophies, and this was his way of, in some ways, honouring the person he'd shot down, and as perhaps a mark of respect to them, he had these little silver cups made, which he kept. And as I said, over the years that he was fighting during the war, he shot down over 80 aeroplanes, so he must have had about 80 cups made. I think in April of one of the years, they called it Bloody April, because they shot down 21 Allied planes during that time. And Richthofen and his band of merry men, because towards the end he was such a good pilot that he actually had his own squadron of 11 airplanes, I believe. And you can look up what that was called and all about it. And you can see on this aeroplane that it's actually made of red plastic. Now that's not coincidental. That's actually because he was known as the Red Baron simply because he painted his airplanes red so that he could be recognized. He wanted people to see who he was, and his comrades to see him when he was flying. And apparently all his flying buddies, they all painted their airplanes in different colours, very colourful and very gregarious colours, and they fly in formation and do all sorts of things, and that's why they got to be known as a flying circus. The flying circus was sort of coined because in them days they did have flying display people, and they would fly in formation and do all sorts of tricks, and the Red Baron, because of his exploits as a fighter pilot. He was they were known as the Red Baron's Flying Circus. Now, I've lost track of what I was saying now. This plane wasn't the only plane that the Red Baron flew. I mean, he flew a lot of airplanes, and this particular triplane, was one he used towards the end of his career. And I think it was this one that he was actually shot down in, a similar one to this. But there was other biplanes with 2 wings, which he scored most of his kills with, and he was able to defeat a great many adversaries. One of the things that he developed, the tactics for flying in formation to attack. He would always make sure that he attacked his prey. He used to fly high and get above his enemy and fly towards them out of the sun. That was a very good way of creeping up on your opponent, flying into the sun, flying out of the sun, I mean, at your opponent, and diving down to get the extra speed. And once they'd found their target, because the guns faced forward, the only way to shoot someone else down was to get behind them. And if you could get up high and fly down out of the sun and be behind your opponent, then there was a good chance you'd shoot him down. He couldn't shoot back at you because you were behind him. And this idea of curling round and swooping down and trying to get behind all the time, that's where the phrase a dogfight came from, because when people saw it from the ground, these fighters chasing each other, they were all chasing each other's tails just like a couple of dogs would. And so they turned the phrase a dogfight between these airplanes as they curled around in the sky over and over, trying to get behind each other, flying up and flying down and trying to get behind so that they could shoot them down with their machine guns. Now, some people might say, why am I making such a fuss, if you like, not a fuss, but why am I saying so much in favour of von Richthofen? Because he was German and I'm English and he was fighting me, and that might seem strange, but to me wartime is a time when wars aren't made by ordinary people. Wars are made by politicians and kings and governments and things that the ordinary common person can't really understand. They don't know what it's all about. All they know is it's their own country, and if the government tells them that they've got to go to war with somebody, then I suppose they've got to go to war. But they don't have a lot of choice about it. Wars are fought by ordinary people. They're the ones that suffer, and they're the ones that have to show the bravery. The politicians sit at home just giving out orders, and the generals just give orders and all that sort of thing. I know there's got to be people to give out orders, but sometimes the actual soldiers, they're just soldiers. They do what they're told and they fight for their country, and they don't have time to think about the rights and wrongs of it. I'm sure if they had a choice, they wouldn't want to go to war. They'd say, no, we're not going to fight. And the First World War was a perfect example of how towards the end, I mean, this war didn't, they called it the war to end all wars, but it didn't. It hasn't, and there's still wars going on today which are almost pointless, but they still go on, and people still haven't learned that you've got to try and get along in this world and work together. So I'm totally against war altogether, but there's got to be a better way than fighting and blowing each other up. I think it's awful. And the loss of life during the First World War was terrible, and it proved nothing. At the end they had an armistice, and they just all decided one day that they'd had enough, and everybody went home, and that was the end of it until World War II started. And it all kicked off again, and we had another war, which I suppose we were lucky, we were fortunate. We won the Second World War, and Germany for a long time was in a bit of a bad way, because they split Germany in half, and half went to the Russians and half to the English. But Germany recovered, as you might expect, and hopefully they'll never have a situation where we go to war with Germany ever again. But there are still people, crazy people. You see them on the news all the time, these crazy people that are fighting and for a cause, God knows what, religion, money, politics, kings and queens, who knows what they go to war for. It's all stupid as far as I'm concerned. But I'm very patriotic with my own thing, as I don't know whether I've mentioned, but I lost two uncles in the war, my father's brothers, and just as another little piece of this video, I'd like to show you this picture here that I've had framed up. And this is just, I'll bring the camera in a little bit closer so you can see. On here is a picture of one of my uncles who, as you see this thing in the middle here, this round bronze disc, this is called a death penny, or a dead man's penny. And underneath his medals, he only had 2 medals because he was an enlisted man. He didn't volunteer to. He went into. He was actually enlisted, so he didn't have the 3 medals. But he's got the 2, and they're in this frame here. And he was a gunner, Alfred John Kelsall, and he was 158th Brigade Royal Artillery. He was an artilleryman. He was also a signaller, and he died in the First World War. And I'll tell you a little story about him in a minute. But he used to do signals, and he drew horses. He knew a lot about horses, so he was able to drive horses, and he drove a gun carriage. And I've got, if I just get up here for a second, I bring down this other picture. This is his brother, Alfred. And he's got the death penny as well, and also his medals. Now these 2 brave young men both died. I think Alfred was 21, and this Edward, or Ned as we called him, was only about 19. They were both killed in the First World War. Edward was 2nd Battalion, Prince of Wales Volunteers, South Lancashire Regiment. Now they both died in the First World War, and it was a great shock to my my family. I'll just push you back now. To lose 2 sons, but they didn't only lose 2 sons. Their father, Jack Kelsall, my granddad, he ran an establishment connected with the war, because as I said, they used horses during the war. Alfred actually drove horses and carriages, gun carriages to artillery, and he was an artilleryman. And when the horses got shell shocked and badly treated, they went wild again, and they had to be retrained to be of any use. I understand that a lot of horses never came back from the war, but my granddad used to run what was known as a remount depot. Now, a remount depot was where they broke in and retrained horses that had been shell-shocked from the war, so they must have brought some back, otherwise he couldn't have had any horses to retrain. And unfortunately, during the time of trying to retrain one of these horses, he got kicked. He got kicked in the chest. And so he was badly injured. In them days they weren't able to do the operations that they can today, and sadly after a long sort of illness after that, he never really recovered, and eventually he died. And it was around about the same time as his 2, I think he was ill in hospital from this accident, when news of his 2 sons, my uncles, got sent through that they died in the war. So and then he died, so the family had lost the matriarch, my granddad, and his 2 elder brothers, which left my granny and my father and his 2 younger brothers, because my father was born in 1901, so he would be only 14 at the time of the war, 14, 18, so he was too young to go, which is just as well, because I've no doubt all I'd have, well, I wouldn't have anything. I'm sure he would have been killed along with his two elder brothers if he'd have gone to war. So I thank goodness that he was too young for the First World War, unfortunately too old for the Second World War. He did serve in the Home Guard, so he did his bit for his country during the Second World War, but he was too old to actually go fighting. But by then we'd got a haulage business, and his wagons were commandeered for the war effort, and so he was able to manage to stay out of any fighting or anything. He sort of did a lot of the backroom business with the lorries, taking supplies to docks and taking things about and doing all that sort of thing. But he joined the Home Guard, and fortunately we didn't have to use the Home Guard because the Germans never actually got over to England, which is a good thing. But if he had done, we'd have been waiting for him, I'm sure, and there would have been a great deal more bloodletting. Now another little thing that I was going to tell you about, they never actually found Ned's body. He got killed somewhere, and they never found his body, so he wasn't buried. But Alf, the gunner, was actually killed, and they had his body, so they were able to bury him, and he's buried in France. And I've seen the pictures of his grave. I've never been there, but I've seen pictures of it, and on his gravestone it mentions his brother as well as Alf. But somebody who witnessed Alf being killed came to my grandparents' house and related an incident that occurred during the time of that. He said that apparently Alf was driving his gun carriage with another officer, I think, on board the gun carriage, and they were crossing a bridge, and there was a lot of shelling going on. And as they crossed the bridge, one of these shells that was being fired at them landed right on the gun carriage and killed my uncle and the officer, I think, who was with him, outright. And that's how he came to be killed. But the remark by one of the officers when he reported what he'd seen and said what had happened, the officer said, how did it occur? And he said, well, they were crossing the bridge and the shell hit and the two men were killed. And the officer said, what else happened? And he said, well, the horses bolted. And he said, oh dear, what happened about those? And he said, oh, the horses survived. They were all right. They managed to get onto the other side and were saved. He said, oh, thank goodness. He said, that's not very good. You lost two men. And he said, yes, but I can get men replaced. It'll only cost a shilling. Whereas a horse costs £20. And that wasn't a very nice thing to say about losing two men. They obviously considered horses were more valuable. They certainly cost more, but they cost more than the lives of a man. And I've just got a thing here, a little token, if you look in here, a little commemorative coin. And what the officer was referring to was this. It's a shilling, 12 pence, 12 old pence, English shilling. And you could get a man you could recruit a soldier by just paying him 1 shilling, and he became a soldier. And this is a commemorative king's shilling, and I kept that. And it's just to think that that's basically a soldier in the war. That's all they're worth. That's all they are. It's just a shilling. So to me, it's a terrible waste of life. War is not a good thing. It wastes men's lives. Well, I think I'm coming towards the end of my little talk about the Red Baron. To me, he was a hero, even though he was on the other side. My uncles were heroes. They fought in the war, and they did their bit. But look up Baron von Richthofen. Here's a little picture of him. You can see he was quite a handsome chap. And that's him, about 21, the Red Baron. And I've got another picture of him here somewhere. There's another picture of him. But look him up, and you'll find What an interesting character. Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the Bloody Red Baron, First World War. And I've got a model of his little triplane which I made. Even the propeller goes round, and I'm quite proud of that little aeroplane. I keep it in a box, specially packed up, and someday I may get round to putting the insignia on, I don't know, but I haven't done it yet, and it's a little bit fiddly. But anyway, that's all from me today. So I hope you enjoyed this little talk, and as I say, go and look up the Red Baron and find out for yourself. And one thing to remember: never get involved with war if you can help it, because war doesn't do anybody any good. It only creates lasting memories of brave men who gave their lives in the call of their duty for their country. There we go. Bye bye now. See you next time. Bye bye.